Hello, my name is Deb Verhoff. I am the Digital Collections Manager for NYU Libraries. I will be presenting today with Karen Hanson, Senior Research Developer for Portico. The title of our presentation is Preserving New Forms of Scholarship, Guidelines for Publishers. Scholars are experimenting with diverse digital technologies to express their research. Publishers, in turn, are working to evolve their platforms and services to support publications that integrate dynamic features. In this effort to keep up with the creative demands of scholars, publications may evolve in ways that present a serious challenge to preservation. In a project funded by Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and led by NYU Libraries, a group of digital preservation institutions, libraries, and university presses collaborated to study examples of these dynamic new forms of scholarship. The project focused on open access ebooks. Project partners included NYU Libraries, Clocks and Portico Preservation Services, Michigan Press, Minnesota Press, UBC Press, NYU Press, and Stanford University Press. There were two main goals for our project. First, to determine whether the ebooks could be preserved in their current form and at scale. And second, to use the findings from this project to develop guidelines in order to help authors and publishers to make similar publications easier to preserve and therefore more sustainable. These are some of the dynamic features in the publications that we looked at: embedded multimedia, nonlinear paths, data visualization, interactive maps, software code, underlying data, and non-traditional approaches to versioning, annotation, and highlights. We also looked at publications based on flexible formats such as EPUB 3 and HTML5. To demonstrate how the project worked, we will walk through a case study. As I remember it, Teachings from the Life of a Slyman Elder is published on RavenSpace, a platform created by UBC Press. They describe RavenSpace as a digital platform for media-rich interactive books where Indigenous communities and scholars can work together respectfully and knowledge circulates across networks and generations. The process that we designed for evaluating publications began with the publisher. For each work, they were asked to identify elements necessary for an archived preservation copy. For as I remember it, the most important properties included the full text and descriptive metadata, multimedia, and interactive features. What is shown in this slide is an acknowledgement that is a pop-up, which appears when you enter the site, asking that you treat the material with respect as if you were coming ashore onto Slyman territory.
Hi, I'm Karen Hanson, and I'm going to explain the approaches we tested for preserving RavenSpace. So the first thing we tried was a full text export and migration strategy, which is what we generally use for traditional publications, where we take the full text data and normalize it to a standard format so that we can easily provide access in the future. For this approach, the publisher shared two things: an export file containing the text and metadata as linked data, and also a folder containing all multimedia and other supplements associated with the book. When we looked at the export file, we saw that it had a lot of platform-specific properties and styling mixed in, and it was difficult to figure out how we might represent a multidimensional linked data format in a more linear format without a significant loss. The export file really seemed more appropriate for migration between RavenSpace platforms than for preservation, but it was useful for metadata, and we were able to extract descriptions for the book and each supplement, but we couldn't see a way to meet the publisher requirements using this method. So the second approach we tried was the website harvesting approach, where a web crawler visits each page and converts them to a web archive file or WARC file. For this, we used the Internet Archive's browser crawler. We first tried a fully automated approach in which the crawler finds and visits the links on each page of the publication. The crawler both missed pages we wanted and also captured pages we didn't want. Some required features didn't function in playback because a user would have needed to interact with them in order to get the data that supports them from the server. In the second web archiving attempt, we did two things. I used the book export file from the publisher to identify the URLs that make up a publication, basically forming a sitemap that I could use to guide the crawler. I also configured Browser to simulate user behaviors that were required to capture dynamic features of the page. For example, since the pop-up notes were a requirement, I configured the crawler to open and close each note so that their text would load from the server. The results were really good, and the publisher felt that this fulfilled the baseline requirements for preservation. In theory, this approach could be repeated for other RavenSpace books. There were a few things missing that were labeled nice to have though. For example, we were able to capture the First Nations language keyboard as required, but you couldn't use it to search since the web harvesting approach can't capture a functioning search engine. So we decided to try an emulation approach. For emulation, the goal was to recreate the publisher platform on a self-contained virtual machine. Since the publishing platform is built using open source software, I was able to do this. I installed RavenSpace and a web browser on a Linux machine, and then I used the export package from the publisher to recreate the book on an empty platform. If I wanted to scale this, I could probably envision automating the task of adding the book to an empty RavenSpace installation with a small script if the supplied files were consistent enough. As a finishing touch, I configured the web browser to open up and automatically to the RavenSpace homepage when the machine started. I then tested the machine by loading it into the emulation as a service infrastructure platform, easy for short, which allows you to emulate a virtual machine in a browser window. I then started the machine without an internet connection and tested it for external dependencies. The result was a working offline version of the ebook that met all of the publisher's criteria for preservation. This was actually a nice surprise because a lot of web applications are not so easy to encapsulate because they have external dependencies. So in each of these three approaches, we found benefits, but also different levels of complexity and risk. Some combination of all three is probably the best approach, but also the most expensive. And note that this example required over a month of experimentation, a preservation cost that's unlikely to be sustainable unless we can find scalable ways to apply the methods. And that's where the guidelines come in. So for each ebook in the project, we documented what helped and hindered preservation. And from these observations, we formed guidelines that could be used by publishers, platform developers, and authors to create works that are easier to preserve. Our aim is to bring awareness of preservation to the creation of new works and minimize loss. So to demonstrate how the guidelines actually connect to the ebooks, here are some that were derived from As I Remember It. So the first one, if you've ever read any guidelines at all for improving web archiving of a site, you've probably seen this one. Include a sitemap XML file for web-based publications. It involves having a file on the website that lists all of the URLs for the site so that a web crawler can then use it as a guide. I was able to generate one for RavenSpace using the export file, but this would be expensive for a preservation service to maintain for every version of every digital platform. And so ideally, it would be a feature of the platform that is maintained in line with any changes. Next, for web-based features that call for a dynamic user experience within a single web page, for example, pop-ups, annotations, data visualizations, and maps, consider designs that preload all data when the page initially loads into the browser. So in our case, we were able to add configuration to Browser to simulate user behaviors that dealt with these features, but it adds manual work to the process that could be avoided. The pop-up notes on RavenSpace, for example, could have been preloaded along with the rest of the text when the page loaded, rather than requiring a user to click on each of them to get the content from the server. And finally, avoid depending on externally hosted web services for content that is required for the publication to function or is a core intellectual component of the work. So this refers to using local copies of things like fonts, CSS, or JavaScript, but also careful use of services such as YouTube. Note that it says avoid rather than do not. The reality is sometimes it's most efficient to use these services, but in doing so, folks should be conscious of the risk and try to make sure there's a backup plan if things disappear. In the case of RavenSpace, the platform was easier to preserve exactly because the vital files were all local to the application. In another publication we worked on, we found that the website would only load after an external font was loaded. Sooner or later, the link to the font would have rotted, and the website would break unexpectedly and require maintenance. So this is a matter of not only preservation, but also reducing long-term maintenance, which was a pattern we saw with a lot of our guidelines. So we've shared the first version of the guidelines online, and they can be found at, all one word, preservingnewforms.dlib.nyu.edu. But this is still really a work in progress, and we're currently working with publishers on a new project that will allow us to test and iterate on these. And as part of this improvement process, we'd really appreciate your feedback, and we welcome any suggestions for making this a more valuable resource for publishers. And with that, we thank you for listening, and we invite your questions.